doing a Tom Cruise impersonation. AI generated the voice. AI was able to generate Tom Cruise's impersonation of Gorbachev, him doing a Russian, the gestures, the facial expressions, all of that. And again, this was one of the first videos that was supposed to be like a turning point in essentially AI and deepfake technology, where like it looks very real. And like Caleb was like, well, it looked kind of old. It's like, yeah, well, I mean, it's a few years old, but it's also the fact that this was just the beginning. It's gotten much better because technology is moving very fast. So I asked ChatGPT for the dangers of AI. And again, we're going to start, and I'm almost done, and then finish the night talking about AI a little bit. This is something I wrote down, though. AI, ChatGPT, it can give the illusion of answers when in reality it can only recite that which you can find online. It is only as reliable as the sources which it has referenced, and it doesn't do an in-depth search unless prompted to. I said that specifically because I've been using ChatGPT actually a bunch lately. Because the reality is this: there were preachers who were afraid of the radio. There were preachers who were afraid of the television. There are ones who were afraid of the internet. I think we found at this point, though, you were missing the boat if you didn't get the opportunity. I mean, if you could preach on the radio when the radio was the thing, you should have done it because you'd reach millions, with the television, with the internet. We want to use technology, but at the same time, with every step of the way, and as we watch some of the evolution of technology in our country and in the world, it comes at a cost. I like to use it a lot because it's basically a faster way than Google. Rather than me doing a Google search and opening up 10 different websites and reading them, it goes and reads 10 websites and then comes back with what it found over the 10 websites. But here's the warning I'd give you guys and anyone else, is that so many people I see today will just ask ChatGPT and assume it got a right answer. This morning when I was asking questions about Laodicea, of which I have stacks of books and I've read through most of them all, I wanted to go on, I said, just fact checked a few of these things. It came back with, well, it's actually not true. Go back and find this pastor. Okay, I found, who does he cite? Here's what they cite. Go deep search that. It came back, actually, no, you're right, it is true. But if I had just taken the face value answer, I would have assumed it was wrong. And a lot of people these days think I can just ask ChatGPT and it's going to give me correct information from the beginning. But again, it'll do a skim of the internet. And so it's a tool. It's a tool that can skim the internet and bring you the first things it finds in a cohesive way. But again, it's like, sometimes I have to tell it, no, do a deep search on this. In fact, that's what I'm most often saying it, dig deeper. And then it'll come back with completely different answers. And I've had it help me put around, I was trying to make the timeline for Adoniram Judson, and I had to keep correcting it. You just gave me a wrong date. I know that's a wrong date. And I was correcting it continually. One of the first times I ever used it was for the youth Bible study a long time ago. I said, give me a 10-question multiple choice on Moses, or it was Abraham. Give me 10 questions about Abraham, multiple choice. 2 out of the 10 were wrong. So again, it's just a reminder that it's a tool, but we can't just assume. And I think that's one of the biggest problems with it these days is people are assuming it's going to get me the correct information. It doesn't, quite often. It's going to get you what it quickly finds on the internet. And quite often there's contradictions, especially with older things where there's the stories have been told by different people different ways, and it ends up giving you conflicting stuff. So that's just a warning. Now let's get back into this, because it did help me a little bit with this, and it's kind of fun. I wrote a lot of it, but, well, the later part it helped me with, not this first part. But I wanted to mention that because I think it's fascinating to see what it came up with. And so I'm going to be pointing that out. When I asked it to come up with this list, notice what it said, and then we'll dig into other stuff. But the churches of Revelation, a quick review. The Church of Ephesus, right? The first letter is the loveless and legalistic apostolic church. It goes from the time of the ministry of Jesus, you could start the start date there, and it goes to either 100 or 155, which is what number I like, because that's when Polycarp died, which would cover the span of time, the reign of the apostles, and those directly discipled by the apostles. Called the legalistic church. Not a title I typically hear, but one I liked for it, because that is what we started to see in the early church already. The lovelessness. When you have law without love, you get legalism. Following the rules. And you know what? To be safe, we might need to make some extra rules. And we already saw this in the first generations after the apostles. We start seeing kind of heaviness of rules coming into the church. And so, again, you've left your first love. That was the verse for them. I got one headline verse for each of these churches. And so There was the first church we looked at. It's this apostolic age, the very earliest people, the people who either, again, walked with Jesus or they walked with those who walked with Jesus. The persecuted church, Smyrna, takes us up to the year 313 when Christianity was legalized. Now, I wrote up there the persecuted ante-Nicene church. Technically, that's 325, but usually that's how people think of it. The ante-Nicene fathers, after it was legalized, the Council of Nicaea was 325 soon later. And I often do find it interesting to read, what did the ante-Nicene fathers have to say? The people back when Christianity was still persecuted. Because you'll find that they're actually fairly universal on many of their beliefs. And it's like many beliefs began to change in the church after that point. The dominating views of eschatology were different before Nicaea versus after Nicaea. And so it's very fascinating to know that in church history. And again, be faithful unto death, I'll give you the crown of life. For 200 plus years, nearly 300 years, Christians were persecuted to the death. We were talking about baptism at the youth study this last week, and we talked about how in the early church, if you read the Bible, it is, you want to be a Christian? Great, let's go find some water. People were getting immediately baptized in the New Testament. But by that early church period, they would wait because there were spies. They were being hunted. And so they didn't want to just let people into the fold. And so it became this delay to baptize. We need to put you some tests, see you in your life. And so you'll start watching as the way we baptize and things started changing in the church. And it changed for practical reasons, not biblical ones. We do lots of things around here for practical reasons. But it's good to know we do this because it's practical, not because this is the way. And so you begin to see an unfolding, though, where some of the things being practiced in the church were changing because they were persecuted. I think we'll find in the early church, people say, well, they met in homes. They did, up to 120, 160 in size, big homes, bigger than our church, right, or about the same size. But the thing is that they would meet as big of a place as they could. They didn't do it because it was better. Once again, I just hear people sometimes say, well, home churches are better because that's what they did in the early church. No, they did it because they were hiding from being persecuted to death. Now, if we get back to that point, home churches will be a good idea again, right? But for right now, we gather as many people as we can get together. And then became the compromising imperial church. Once Christianity became legalized, it changed everything. Theology changed. All of the ante-Nicene fathers, up to 313, every one of them was premillennial. We believe that Jesus Christ is coming back to rule and reign for 1,000 years on the earth, in Jerusalem, etc., etc. The same as I believe. After this point, though, we begin to see amillennialism come into the church. Because as they see Christianity now spreading and even controlling the globe, maybe this is the millennium. I mean, look. We're in charge. The church is taking over the world. And so you see an amillennial, post-millennial type view where it's this, there's not a literal millennium, it's the church reigning, and it becomes symbolic. You see with Origen and with Augustine that the allegorical interpretation of the Bible now comes in. Well, these other guys are taking it literally, but obviously we should be taking it allegorically. So there's a big change there, but also the compromise. Because it's much easier to join a church when you're not going to be killed for it. So everyone would join. In fact, people were forced to join. Once it became the official imperial church, you had to join in a sense. Everyone becomes a Christian, whether they were devout believers or not, and compromise creeps in. One verse that stands out, Revelation 2:15, right? That you hold to the doctrine of the Nicolaitans, those things which I hate. So we begin to see people holding on to doctrines that are false teachings that Jesus doesn't like. They're compromising. But compromise leads to corruption. 590, that period that ended the last and begins the next, that was the date again of Pope Gregory the Great. And he was the one who in many ways, he made a lot of changes in the Roman church, the universal church, which is Catholic in Latin. And he formalized a lot of what the modern Roman Catholic Church looks like today. And so many of the things we can attribute to the Roman Catholic Church today, this is kind of when it officially got started. And we cover this whole period of the Middle Ages. And it was a dark time for the church. It really was. And so this is the corrupt church. And we saw a lot of corruption in the Roman Catholic Church. Stuff that, none of us should be thankful or proud to speak about, but it was there. It happened. It's part of church history. Revelation 2:20, you allow that woman Jezebel to teach and seduce my servants. And it was just the idea. That's symbolic in a sense of, it was literal for that church, but as far as the history goes, it's a reminder that they began to put things in place that were just straight up wrong. And they were allowing these things to continue. And there were popes that were doing the most outlandish of things you could ever imagine until 1517, which we picked the date because of Martin Luther and his 95 Theses. When he pinned up those 95 arguments against the Roman Catholic Church and their practices, and that kind of really got the Reformation started, where the Protestants pulled away. And we spend some time talking about why is the Protestant church, the Reformation church, called the dead church? And part of what we talked about was it's because they saw the need of change in all these theological issues, but they didn't go all the way and change. So ironically, they got rid of certain Catholic doctrines that they saw were unscriptural, but they continued to baptize people right on into the church from infanthood. And so there was people who essentially, again, they were part of the church, but they still weren't born-again believers, but they're officially. And where the Catholic Church was the imperial church, when the Protestants broke away, we covered it that night, how really all the different nations just became Protestant nations. So you saw the official Lutheran Church of the Germans or up in the Netherlands. You see the official Dutch Reformed Church. You see the official Presbyterian Church. You see the Church of England. And so it was just the same thing almost. It was like the Catholic Church, but just with a different form, a few less doctrines that were unbiblical. But there was an issue there where it was like the whole thing hadn't gone all the way. There was more change needed. And that's where we saw the Church of Philadelphia, the faithful missionary revival church, where we see the first Great Awakening, the second Great Awakening, the Moravian revival, on up to the current revivals. We see missionaries going out, the seeking of the lost, great teaching of the Bible, and all that list of men that I both read about and sang about last week. And so that takes us up to where we are now. And I picked 1914 as the ending date. World War I. That was something that really changed things in the world. And there was things leading up to World War I, and that takes us to our current, Laodicean history, 1914 to the present. Now, I do want to back up slightly. We'll get a running start on the year 1914, but this is kind of eye-opening as you start seeing little things that began to take place. And eventually, somewhere in this, you'll all begin to get to the era where you were born and then the era you lived through, right? Because it goes from then all the way to now. So you're all going to eventually be hitting home more and more as we get further along. But one quote I wanted to give, Pope John Paul II, as the family goes, so goes the nation, and so goes the whole world in which we live. You know, we're going to find a lot of the downfall here. The church has its role. The government has its role. Technology plays a role. Public education plays a role. Culture as a whole. But one thing that goes through all of this, which I don't highlight with my specific points as much, but it's the family at the end of the day. As families were taken apart and the traditional roles of families change, everything else flows out of that. That's why I really want our church to continue to emphasize. We want to spend time with marriage, spend time with parenting, spend time with family, because this is what changes the whole environment of where we live. As families are transformed, then churches and communities are therefore transformed from there. So, the prelude leading up to this time period. This is just some important things getting before World War I. 1850 is just kind of a ballpark era. But leading up to World War I, and I guess there's my other bullet point, from this time period, oh wait, this is not supposed to be a bullet of this. That's my bad. I didn't tell them not to do this. Let's go like this. I clicked it too many times. Let's try this again. Boop, 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 boop. Got it. These were the time periods when I asked ChatGPT to help. I said, break it down into logical time periods. And I told it what I was trying to do and what my vision was. And so it broke it down into time periods. And then I made some edits. I changed some dates to what I thought was a little bit better. But notice this. This is just fascinating. This was something, and when it was all done, this is the headings of our sections we're going to cover. Just look at the dates. The first time period is about 70 or 65 years, okay? Then the next time period, 30-ish years. Then you're looking at 20-ish years, right? Then you're looking at like 20-ish years, down to 81, 15 years, a little under 15 years, down to 4 years, down to 3 years, down to 3 years. What fascinated me was as we were looking at these massive changes in the world and society, you go from 65, 30, 40, 20, 15, 3. The world is changing rapidly now. What used to take a generation to change, it's now changing in just a few years. And again, it's like a countdown clock. It can't go much further. And that's kind of my closing point and main point of this whole time tonight is how much longer can the world last at this rate? So we're going to walk our way up here. But again, it's this idea. How much longer can the world last at this rate? I don't think it's going to last this way forever. I think we all know that. So all that said, now I'm going to go there. Okay, so the prelude, this beginning up to World War I, just leading up events. Technology in the world. So the Industrial Revolution, this is leading up to World War I. Industrial Revolution means men leaving the home. And this was a big deal because for thousands of years, the norm was even if you were a slave, you and your family lived at your master's house and worked on your master's farm. The blacksmith was named Smith because it was his house. He was Mr. Smith, and everyone came to your house to do blacksmithing work. They came to your house to get sewing done. They came to you. The husband lived at home and worked at home, and everyone came there. Little boys and girls grew up with dad at home until the Industrial Revolution, where men began to go to work. And this was a big deal. But it was during this time also, railroads, telegraph, electricity was expanding. The world was getting smaller. You think about Daniel. Here we are just, even 150 years ago, but Daniel spoke about seal up the words of this prophecy, God to Daniel, until the time of the end. And what's going to happen? People are going to go to and fro, and knowledge will increase. And I think as we go through tonight, we're going to see how the ability to move about and knowledge to increase, it's changing rapidly. We see mass printing, public education growing, and of course, flight, right? Big thing is this: the world was just getting started, but this technology is now rapidly changing everything. The medieval church, there was almost no technological changes in Europe for 1,000 years. In fact, the Greeks and the Romans were more advanced in their educational system and mathematics and architecture and all that than you saw for 1,000 years in the Middle Ages. Very few new technologies during that time. Now technology is just exploding. We also see Darwin beginning to come in the late 1800s, right? 1859, his book comes out. Evolution begins to come in there and undermine the scripture. And for a long time, no one wanted to fight it. In fact, the church didn't fight it. They just found ways to make the two work. We'll take this as fact, and we'll do a gap theory or a day-age theory or theistic evolution theory. And we begin to see higher criticism growing, this concept that we're smarter than the Bible. So this is all starting. But in this period of the late 1800s, okay, the church, high attendance, strong missionary expansion, biblical literacy was generally high, and cultural Christianity was dominant. This was a Christian nation at that time. This was the way people felt and believed. And realistically, our whole culture was shaped around it. Public morality shaped by Christian ethics, authority structures were respected. There was a family-centered culture, and there was optimism about the optimism about human progress dominated, right? There was just this general, it was a positive thought, positive time in many ways. And then it takes us to this period, the beginning of the Laodicean age, from World War I to World War II. And what's interesting is what's the technology that we see during that time? Well, during those wars, the first machine guns, the first tanks, the first chemical warfare. Radios enter the home. Now everyone can hear what's going on from everywhere. You don't need to actually get the mailman to come or go for a long walk. People are now all connected in their homes. Mass propaganda is normalized. That might sound silly to you, but I still like watching the World War II Disney, like Donald Duck ones. And I grew up on edited versions. And even the 80s edited versions, they would not be allowed on TV today. But it's fun going back and watching the original ones. The global death toll exceeds 80 million. Oh, that's actually World War II. This they got mashed together. 20 million during World War I, 60 million during World War II, and of course the atomic bomb at the end of that era. But something I want to point out here, the beginning of that era was the lost generation. And then you have the greatest generation. The greatest generation are the guys who fought in World War II. It's a cool group of guys and a cool generation to talk about. My grandma and grandpa, the ones who were there building planes and fighting on the shores of Normandy and all that kind of stuff. But the lost generation, what's that? You see, in the 1800s, remember that list I gave about how the church was doing good, Christian ethics, a general optimism? When that generation went off to World War I and saw death like death had never been seen before, with machine guns and chemical warfare and trench warfare and tanks and flamethrowers and all this new stuff developed to kill, they came back from World War I very disillusioned. They were pretty messed up in a time that didn't really, recognize PTSD, that didn't recognize depression, that didn't recognize all these mental problems. And so again, they were questioning everything. It's kind of just like what all they believed in, they began to wonder, why do we even believe in this stuff? We used to trust the government and trust that things were good and trust that, and so there's this big thing going on. Cynicism and moral experimentation increase. And while men were away at war, women headed to the workplace. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but bear with me on this. Does anyone under the age of 40 know who this is? I was just curious if any of the young people knew who that was. Caleb does, but you're weird and you're a nerd, and so you're not under the age of 40, I don't think. Are you close? You're right around there. Yeah. Well, there we go. You're right around there. Good. Anyone near the age of... Other people know Rosie the Riveter. What's great about Rosie the Riveter is that she always reminded me of my grandma. And of course, grandma met grandpa building B-52s or whatnot. That's my grandparents. But my whole life, my grandma, it was a blue and white dotted bandana every time I saw her. That's what she wore. It's like how my grandma dressed. It even looks like my grandma, to be honest. Here's the thing, though, is that women going to the workplace created another problem now because dad was already gone at war. And now mom is gone. And now we have kids with no parents now. It's kids being raised in daycares. It's kids being raised in school systems. Now again, this is so normal today because we live in the Laodicean age. But the reality is that for hundreds and thousands of years, kids grew up with their parents. And even when they went to school was only a few hours of the day, like they'd go away just for a short period, and they spent the majority of their time at home where mom and dad were. And so you'll see a big part of this even is for the decline in masculinity, really in men, because they lost their male role model, and now they only had mom, and now they lose mom too. Now, girls and boys are going to suffer from that, but some of this stuff I loved how... There was a men's group called the Men's Fraternity, and in it they just talked about, as you watch history, some of the things that were kind of crippling men and understanding what real masculinity looks like. Because again, with World War II, as World War II came to an end, again, we had absent fathers, they were gone. And then even when they came home, many of the people were gone in a different kind of way. The post-war prosperity, the seeds of lukewarmness, 1946 to 1963-ish. This is the age of the baby boomers, right? But many people came home, and this was the time where there was cars in every driveway, turkeys in every oven. It was a very good time for America in many ways. You see that televisions enter nearly every home. Suburban expansion and consumer economy explode. Again, the baby boomer generation begins. Now, if you're familiar with the book of Judges, you know how it goes. Times of affliction, God sends the deliverer, but when the deliverer comes and the people see affluence again, they forget about God and things usually begin to tank, kind of. So during this period, churches are actually doing really well. It says there's church construction booms, church attendance peaks in the U.S., but Christianity becomes more culturally assumed. It really is the American dream and the American way of the 50s. It's just kind of, this is what Americans are, and this is what Americans do. And again, at this point, it's becoming more normal for dad to be checked out because he's got to provide that American dream. So he's gone all the time. He's working at the work, and he comes back, and a lot of times the dad would come home, and of course he's going to be off hunting or watching the game or this or that. You see things taking place at home. Culturally, entertainment becomes the central cultural force. Again, the 60s, you got music, television, things are changing. The Beatles are on TV. Wealth increases rapidly, and it was. America was growing very wealthy, very fast. Dr. Benjamin Spock, parenting philosophy, reshapes discipline, 1946. Dr. Spock was big on the whole, don't discipline your children, that would hurt them. You want to let them just, be themselves and kind of let kids roam free. I just kind of like free-range children. That's kind of the idea of it, right? Washington, I'm sure, will adopt that soon. Free-range, no-cage kids. And so comfort begins to replace sacrifice. And that's kind of what it is things were so good that we wanted it good, and we were getting used to it good. But this is where the 60s into the 80s, ChatGPT came up with the title, The Great Moral Fracture. I kind of like that one because a lot of stuff happened in those 60s as a result of the baby boomer parents and the people who grew, again, World War I and World War II, these events, the Industrial Revolution, they had an effect. And it was almost like it was a bubble that continued to grow. And during the 60s, that bubble finally pops. So we see during the 60s, 1962 and 3 is when prayer and the Bible were removed from public schools, right? That there used to be a public Bible reading. There used to be public mandatory time of prayer. Those things get taken out at the beginning of the 60s. The birth control pill comes out during the 60s. Mass media saturation, the Vietnam War. Roe versus Wade legalizes abortion in 1973. Youth rebellion and rock culture dominate. There's the hippies. There's everything else. There's the drugs that come in. Really, it's the big movement that is preceding the Jesus revolution. But you'll find the 60s and the 70s, I'm speaking from my generation as a millennial or younger. We grew up watching movies and things and depictions that made the 60s and 70s look cool. It wasn't until I was an adult that I maybe watched some different movies that were maybe more realistic movies, I don't know. And you started seeing how dark the 60s and 70s were. Just how immoral that time period was and just how crazy things were. And honestly, things looked like they were going to crash and burn from the way I read it. And the Jesus movement really did turn things back on track, at least for a season. And so the 60s things got crazy. And again, we see mainline churches decline rapidly during the 60s and 70s, but evangelical churches grow at this time during the Jesus movement. So it's like some churches are emptying out, other churches are beginning to fill. Moral collapse. Again, sexual revolution fully erupts. Divorce rates skyrocket. The feminist movement reshapes gender roles. Masculinity is now frowned upon. Authority rejected, and truth becomes personal, and God is removed from public life. That's it. The 60s and 70s were dark times. I didn't get the time to go find the graphs, but there are so many graphs you can find. I don't think it's fair to say that this is an exact cause and effect, but you see at the beginning of the 60s, prayer and the Bible removed from schools. And during the 60s, you watch as divorce rates skyrocket. You watch as abortion rates skyrocket. You watch as drug use skyrockets. If you look at a graph from 1900 to 2000 and you watch the 60s and just everything immoral begins to shoot through the roof. And it was, like I said, it was like a balloon was going to pop. And there was tension from the previous generations, from the lost generation, the greatest generation, pouring into the baby boomers. It's now getting poured into their kids. And so now you have Gen X. Gen X is starting to come up here in this time period, and it's moving now even into the early time of the millennials. Well, this is the millennial time period. The affluence and the age of the megachurch. The Jesus movement got things on track to an extent, but then it's like churches began to explode, and you have the megachurches, and again, you have another period of affluence in our nation. What changes during the 80s into the 90s and 2000s? A lot, but of course, cable television comes into, you get all sorts of TV, and you get cable was allowed for bad stuff, right? I just remember, now it's I don't think any of the young people even know there's a difference, but it used to be kind of bad and edgy things could be on cable TV, but on the normal channels, you didn't get that stuff. For whatever reason, cable could be, you could get away with some swear words or this or that. I just remember that as a kid, on cable TV, things were a little bit edgier. Personal computers enter the homes. Video games become dominant youth entertainment, right? So things that used to be not so common now are coming to be very common. Things that used to be, you had to go somewhere to use a computer or play video games, now they're all entering into the home. Another interesting thing during this time period is credit card debt is normalized. Just the concept that debt's okay and normal becomes a normal thing. Everyone does it. It wasn't that way a long time ago, but again, you got to pay for all this stuff. You can't get the TV and the computer and the video game system without some debt. ChatGPT made this list. I'm just going to share it, but church condition. Again, during the 80s and 90s, into the 2000s even, market-driven ministry models dominate. Worship becomes performance-oriented. Sermons shorten. Tithing declines relative to wealth growth. Celebrity pastors rise. Comfort is expected as normal Christian life. Mainstream denominations decline greatly. So it was beginning in the 60s, has even picked up speed in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, and still today. But let me share this. This is stuff I took out of this morning's sermon when I'm talking about how only 4% of Americans had a biblical worldview. Take us back to the 80s and 90s. A 1998 survey asked pastors if Jesus literally rose from the grave. 30% of Presbyterians said no. 33% of American Baptists, 35% of Episcopalians, and 51% of Methodists. So this was a survey, and again, I got the names of surveys elsewhere, but it was one survey given where they went around and asked the mainstream denominations. Now, I don't know if that means they asked all the branches of the mainstreams or if they only asked the main branch, because in most of the mainstream churches, the main branch is the most liberal branch. And it's usually the smaller branches that have broken off down over time that are the more conservative ones. And so when specifically asked of Methodist pastors, same survey, 82% said that the Bible is not the perfect word of God, and 30% denied that Jesus is God. This was from that 1998 survey. A 1986 survey, only 16% of Presbyterian members and only 5% of Presbyterian clergy said that the Bible should be taken literally. And isn't it interesting that the members of the church, there's still more of them than the clergy? Because that's a turning point. When you start seeing the liberal pastors take over. I grew up in the Presbyterian church, and we had an old guard. I mean, there were people who'd been in the Presbyterian church for 50 years when I was a kid, and they remember the church being a good church, and they weren't ready to leave yet. But our church was fairly divided. We had people who were pretty hardcore, and we had other people who were hardcore in a different kind of way. And there was this division within the church where you had the conservative members and you had the not so conservative members. You had the super liberal people, and then you had the not so super liberal. I still thank God for Leo Mayhem, my little children's ministry, like when I was in kids' church as a kid. I remember loving this guy, and he loved Jesus, and he always loved teaching us stuff. And actually, he was a Pentecostal who snuck into the Presbyterian church. He was an infiltrate. No, that's where his background was, but his wife was more comfortable. I learned this in later years. And so they opted to go to the Presbyterian church because that's where she wanted to go. But he was a really zealous, on-fire guy and loved Jesus. And I remember teaching me as a kid. And so we had it both. But when the clergy start going liberal, when the theological schools, the seminaries start going liberal, that's when you have a serious problem. So there's the 80s and 90s. Now, things are getting quick here. 2001 to 2014, the digital revolution, right? High-speed internet becomes universal. Hear that, kids? There was a time before high-speed internet. Just making sure all the little ones are listening in the back. All right. Smartphones introduced. The iPhone came out in 2007. Social media reshapes communication and identity, and it really does. I've had my Facebook account since 2005, a lot longer than most people have. That was back when you had to be a college student at a four-year university to get a Facebook account. It was only for college students and only at four-year universities. And then they opened it up to like community colleges, and then eventually they opened it up to high schoolers before they actually opened it up to all ages. So when I first joined, you had to have a college email to sign up for your account. That's just how it started. But again, it took off and grew. Online gaming becomes immersive and global, and it really is. Video games continue to evolve. They continue to become more addictive. They really do. They become because it's the whole dopamine thing. They become more stimulating and more stimulating and more stimulating. And of course, with the smartphones and the high-speed internet and all of that, pornography becomes free, private, and unlimited. And that's just the reality of the world we live in. You don't have to pay for it. You don't have to leave the house for it. And there's no shortage of it. And so, just for what it's worth, because this ties into the world we live in, I looked up a few different surveys. This one says 54% of practicing Christians use pornography, according to one survey. 75% of men and 40% of women. Now, the wording got changed a few times as I was moving from one thing to the next. So this is like accessed in the last month is what that basically came down to. And it didn't talk about more than once. It just has seen pornography within the last month. And I've seen different stats in the past about whether intentional or unintentional, and you can break it up. But for what it's worth, here it is. Now, though, this is a different survey in the past month, adult use. This is just a nationwide people in general, not Christian. Those first numbers are of people identifying as Christians. 91.5% of men and 60.2% of women. Past month. 42% of youth. And so they were looking at adolescent age. So under 18 and like over the age of 10. It says that the average first exposure to pornography is 12 years old in America right now. One other interesting statistic is it says 50% of those people said it was unintentional. So they were first exposed to pornography by age 12, but it was unintentional. Which is why we encourage parents, right? You know, actually, I tell my kids this is a general rule. This is not a pornography thing. This is general. Accidents happen. And I tell them, I get that. Accidents happen. But then I remind them, but there are certain things, there are accidents that can never happen or should never happen. When they accidentally hurt a sibling, it's one thing. Judah's back there. He put him on the spot. I think it was you and Benny, got Benny in the eye with a pencil or something like that one time. And I just explained, it's like, and it was an accident. They were just goofing off. He didn't mean to hurt his brother. But I'm like, you realize you were a quarter of an inch of an accident you can't come back from. So this is why certain games just can't happen if you're going to put your eyes at danger, because you don't want to lose an eye. And you, the rest of your life, will realize you blinded your brother, and you don't want that. Well, when it comes to letting our kids on technology and having access to the internet, some accidents just should never happen. And if we're wise about it, we can avoid it. There's ways to do that. Maybe when you do the next parenting thing, hopefully in the new year, do a parenting thing we can talk for a while about just, ways to protect our kids. No internet is the safest route, right? If they have no access to the internet, then they're going to be fine. If they have no access to electronics other than what you supervise and give them, you're going to be a whole lot safer. Still, during this time period, we're still in that early 2000s period, sexualization of childhood accelerates, and it really is. The idea of younger and younger kids dressing in sensual ways, marketing. I remember, she would hate this probably, but shopping for underwear for Haley when she was like 6, and I was shocked at what kind of underwear was available for a 6-year-old. I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, why do we need these options? Like, there's only one kind of underwear a kid needs at 6, and it's big, fluffy, big underwear, nothing small and skimpy. Private sin normalized through screens. And again, it's just this idea that so much can be done at home now that people don't know. You don't have to go to the movies to watch a rated R movie that you probably shouldn't be watching, let alone pornographic or anything else, because you can just do it at home and no one will ever be the wiser. Dopamine addiction becomes structural. I like that wording. Because when you pull the lever on a slot machine, there's a scientific fact, you get a dopamine release. And when you knock out a row in Candy Crush, you get a dopamine release. And when you play a video game and you get a good headshot, there's a dopamine release. And when Elmo gets tickled, there's a dopamine release. I don't know, there's all these different things. And what you'll find is that they're good at what they do, those who provide entertainment, because they're making money. And they realize the more dopamine releases people get, the more people are going to be addicted to that stuff and want it more and more, consume it more and more, which brings in more and more money. And so you'll find that Entertainment today is by nature and design more addictive than it was back in the day. If you've forgotten, go watch a 1980s Sesame Street. That's my generation. You can watch older if you grew up on older. But it was boring as all can be. It was horribly boring. I just went and watched an 80s, Sesame Street, and it's just like, this is really boring. No wonder I wasn't addicted back then, because but today, things are so much more interactive. It really is just something that hooks kids. And of course, haven't brought it up until now, but the cultural shift in the LGBT stuff. During this time period, homosexuality is reframed from behavior to identity. Born this way becomes the narrative that dominates the culture. And it grew in the early 2000s. It was continuing, it may have been growing since before that, but now it's starting to really pick up some speed in the early 2000s. It's becoming normal on TV, normal in other places. Now, 15 to 19, I'm going to move a little quicker through this stuff because we should all know most of this. But again, algorithms shape news, sexuality, and worldview. At this point, they have mathematical formulas that know how to give you what you want when you want it. And they have things where when you use your phone number at Safeway to do your shopping and you use your credit card over here, you can come home and find advertisements targeted to you because, again, it's now down to a science. Finding you guys and giving you what you want is becoming a science. Virtual identity takes over real-world character. Oh, did this go out of order? Let's see here. There. Oh, I did it out of order, but I'll back up here. Children raised on screens from infancy. And that's a big thing, Kids are just handed cell phones. You get on the airplane, and you just watch, plop them down with a phone in front of them. You go on a long car ride, pop them down with something in front of them. Hey, I'm not opposed to you wanting to entertain your kids however you want, when you want. I would just encourage every parent, you let your kids do whatever you feel you're called and allowed to let them do. My only question is, but can you parent them without it? Because if you can't parent them without that, you have a big problem, right? If you can't parent your own child without a tablet or a distraction, you're not a parent. The tablet is the parent. Now, again, doesn't mean you can't ever let them watch it. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that, again, if you can't handle your own child without distracting them with something, you're in a dangerous place as a parent because you're setting yourself up for 16-year-olds that you cannot control at all. I clicked the button again, even though there's still things up there. So virtual identity takes over real-world character. In short, people are more concerned about what they look like on Instagram than they do what they look like in real life, right? What your online presence is versus the reality of your life. And again, gender fluidity is normalized. Moral absolutes are openly rejected. Specific things. That one guy, Obergefell, and Hodges legalizes same-sex marriage. So the law gets passed in 2015, right? Nationwide, the White House goes red, white, and blue and colors of the rainbow, or not red, white, and blue, but the red, yellow, green, and blue, purple, and gold, and colors of the rainbow on the White House, right? This became a big thing in America. Marriage is now redefined by the state, and I like this. Christian sexual ethics becomes openly countercultural. It is now basically the reality that the world we live in might have been this way in the 60s some, but again, by the 80s and 90s, you might think that we were an ethical nation again to some extent, but we're getting back to that point again. It's a little bit of a cycle that to have Christian views are counterculture. If teenagers want to be a rebel, the best way to do it is to be a born-again Christian. You'll be a rebel. COVID, an era we know so much about. Stuff I don't need to talk much about because, again, we know about it. There's global lockdowns, government regulation of worship. Digital life becomes primary reality. And emergency powers and surveillance are normalized. There's a lot of stuff changing, and it was kind of, well, there's a need, and now it's becoming normal. And now things that weren't normal a few years ago, they're now normal now. The idea of digital life becoming primary reality. It is true that so many people, it is. It's what you see online. It's what you see on Instagram. That's becoming reality for so many people. And I think it's on here, and I might just be jumping the gun to say it, or maybe I deleted it. I don't know. It's such a long list. But isolationism becomes normal. You can stay at home. You can order your food to your door, whether prepared food by Uber Eats or unprepared food by Walmart, right, or whoever. Your food's delivered to your door. Your entertainment is delivered to your door. Your friends don't need to come over because you've got them online. And so many people isolate themselves. And the reality is that it's too easy to just turn things off when you don't want to watch it and you don't want to hear it. And it's the same with people want to speak truth into your life. They want to call you out. They want to hold you accountable. Accountability is just dropping through the floor because, again, you can do all these things without ever being seen, and you're never interacting with people who can hold you accountable. And so this is where the world is greatly changing, is that there's nothing to hold us accountable because we're so isolated. This morning, I wanted to tangent longer the church in Laodicea, the church, or of the Laodiceans, the church in here, the church in there. It's that great reminder. The church with a capital C is the universal church of Christ. With a lower C, it is individual churches and gatherings all over. But the emphasis is, it's the ecclesia, called out. We're the called out ones. And I've had to tell so many people online, in love, hoping the best for them, well, I don't have to go to church because we are the church. I go, you're almost right, because you said we are, but what you meant is I are the church. And you aren't the church. You're a part of the church. So if you hang out by yourself and isolate, you're in disobedience. You need to be out there with people, not isolating. You need to be surrounding yourself with other Christians. We're the called out ones. It's in the Old Testament, it's the word assembly. If you're not assembling, you're a dismembered body part. And someone's always like, but what about the person who's stuck in bed and they this and that? And I go, well, duh, I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about the 99% of the people who just don't want to leave the home. Yes, God bless that we have online streaming services for people who are stuck at home. And it's great when you're traveling, and you kind of just would rather watch your own church maybe, but it's good to go visit other churches, or whatever it may be. But the reality is that we're called to gather. We're called to gather. And so there's a blessing to live streaming and online church, but it's not the same as gathering. And it never will be. Because you can hear the word, but I could read a book and do that too. But I can't get with other people. I can't be poured into, and I can't pour into them. And it's just not the same as a message. It's still not the same as a phone call, as when you get around other people. And so that's something about the age we're living in right now, is the normalization of isolation. Now, under COVID, again, we watched an interesting thing take place, right? Many churches closed permanently. Many believers, I didn't put it in quotes, but I wanted to, never return. Yet other churches grow. Just like we see a division from the mainstream churches and the evangelical churches, now we're still seeing more division. Certain churches are folding, other churches are growing. I do think in these last days we're seeing the true church staying strong and continuing to grow. It is. And I think we're seeing churches full of people, like again, the people who never came back to church. I mean, that makes me wonder what they were there for in the first place. And I mean, there's everyone with a unique situation, so I can't broad brush everyone, but it is. I think in many ways, it was a good thing. I think some churches shut down that didn't need to be open. Other churches got even bigger. And so people were getting saved. I remember talking to Steve Winery from Calvary Chapel Tri-Cities just about how many people got saved during COVID and were getting baptized who were coming from other churches. And they were doing the altar calls and they were getting baptized because they're like, we've never heard the gospel before, gone to church for 40 years, never actually understood this stuff. So again, after COVID, during COVID, fear reshapes values. A lot of people are living in fear of things. And sometimes it's funny because it's like, I'm sometimes surprised by people who seem like they're not afraid of this, but then they're totally afraid of that. Rather than just trusting God in all of it, wise choices, this and that. But again, it's like there's a lot of fear driving people. Here it is. I knew it was on my list somewhere. Isolation normalized. We already just talked about that. The state increasingly viewed as protector. And this is a common thing we see historically. People begin to become more and more dependent upon the state. LGBT ideology embedded into education, corporations, medicine, and military. So what was getting normalized is now getting institutionalized, right? And dissent, you disagree, punished through job loss and cancellation. We saw that during COVID with the vaccine. We see that even now, if you want to speak out against immorality, you might lose your job. And then these last few years, artificial intelligence, surveillance, and the end of privacy. It made this list. I'm going to focus on one thing mostly at the end here, but technology in the world, artificial intelligence explodes globally, right? AI is now a big thing. And I'm telling you, we use AI for different stuff. We have those little short videos we release on social media. For those who see those little 2-minute, 1-minute Facebook clips. AI watches the sermon and then suggests to us what we should use for our short clips. I mean, we pick what we want, but it's like, it goes through and says, this would probably make a good clip. And we watch, you're like, you were right. That is a good clip. We'll use that clip. And it's things like that. Like, it's very useful. But on the other side, I'll talk more about AI. And again, deep fakes, it's already made this list also. So we'll talk about that stuff later. But the church, again, review from this morning. Biblical worldview at historic lows. Currently, 4% of U.S. adults hold a biblical worldview, according to that one survey that I quoted from this morning. Down from 6% in 2020. And those were just typical biblical views. It's not a biblical worldview, it's just a Christian view is what it was. So it's sad. And again, it was less than half of the pastors met. In fact, it was only 37% of the pastors surveyed met the criteria. Almost to the end. Moral and identity collapse. So again, we know this. This is the world we live in now. Truth is fluid. Gender is fluid. Identity is self-defined. Persecution tolerance near zero. That's not even persecution tolerance. That's poor wording on ChatGPT's part. I would just say this. Disagreement tolerance is near zero. I saw the coolest little short. Frank Turk, great apologetics guy. Some girl or guy, or who knows these days, was upset at him and basically just told him that, the long story short is like, I wish I had it, I didn't plan to share this, but just basically that, I can't handle all this hate and the hate you spew and this and that, and she had this big rant and then she just walks off. Some people cheer this and that. And he's, well, wait, I just want to respond to this because he basically said, if disagreement is hate, then what you just told me is you hate me. Talking to the lady who just shared. Because that's what she was saying. If you disagree, if you say that LGBT is wrong, if you say this or that, you hate us. Well, from what I'm hearing then, is if you're saying that, then that means you hate me because if disagreement is hate, you just hated me. But that's where the world's at. A huge portion of the liberal woke culture, if you disagree, that's hate. Charlie Kirk hated people because he didn't agree with them and respectfully articulated his thoughts, tried to probe people and get them to think and articulate their thoughts. And he always said, we need to keep talking because when people stop talking, that's when things get violent. The fact that he was saying how we need to keep communication going so we can understand this stuff and talk it out. I'll share my views and I'll listen to your views. And he was very good at what he does. And he put people on the spot who weren't very smart and didn't know what they were talking about. But that's the thing. They need someone to speak truth in their life. Trans ideology supersedes sexual orientation. Again, it's just this whole ideology. Biology is separated from identity. Again, it doesn't matter what biology says. It's just what you think and feel. Children targeted through the education systems. And there's a lot of crazy stuff going on. A parent from one of the youth just sent me a link, someone to follow who just goes over Washington OSPI stuff and just all the stuff that's getting pushed through the school systems. Parents overridden by state policy, and it is. It's, if you send your kids to Rome for education, don't be surprised when they come back acting like a Roman. That's just what it is. Just know, I mentioned this just recently. Again, if you send your kids off to public school, just know that you're going to need to take time to learn what they learned and maybe undo some of it. It's a viable option. It's just not like a click and forget option. It's one that you still have to invest in your children. End of story. All right. I said I wanted to begin and end on AI. This was kind of important, I thought, because this is really watching the history, right, of just things getting to where they are today. Some of that stuff's new for you guys. Some of that stuff's old news. You knew some of this stuff. But I think we could take the Bible and just temporarily set it on the shelf take all Christian morality and set it on the shelf, take everything about, end times prediction, all of that. If you just look at the economy and the state of the world in general, not morality and immorality, just, I don't know how much longer we can last. Just the way everything's going. In fact, I was watching a Vodi Bakum interview with Ben Shapiro, and he was actually even saying that, the fall of the nation, he felt like the fall of the American economy was a bigger deal than the morality of America, because he was just saying, but this is where things fall apart. Some things can get fixed, but this is something we just can't, revival doesn't fix the economy. So I asked ChatGPT, my final thing I asked, you show me what the dangers of AI, robotics, and automation are to civilization. And then it sent me a link to watch the Terminator movie. And I was like, that wasn't what I wanted. No, just joking. It wasn't, the computers taking over. What AI and automation, robots, are already replacing. Is this going to be a bulleted list? It is a bulleted list. Okay. This is the list it gave me. This is already going on right now. Call centers, customer support, data entry and clerical work, bookkeeping and basic accounting, paralegal document review, entry-level graphic design, stock trading analysis, medical imaging pre-reads, translation services, we're using that, journalism summaries, social media marketing, junior-level coding, and retail, i.e. self-checkout and online sales. Currently, AI and automation, robotics, right, are replacing all these jobs. It then says in the next 5 to 15 years, we should expect, because the technology is already there, it's just a matter of implementing it and integrating it. Expect that truck drivers are going to go away. Delivery drivers are going to go away, and most warehouse labor is going to go away. Fast food workers, manufacturing assembly, security guards, portions of nursing and caregiving, and construction robotics. Stuff that's already in the works, already being done. You see, I was asking these questions because there's a reality as we talk about the gap between the wealthy and the not wealthy, the upper class and the lower class. Technology and AI are not replacing the upper class. They're replacing the lower and middle class. What are the people going to do when there's no more jobs for them? And that's the reality of what's going to happen. It gave me a very long, point-by-point breakdown of this is how it's happened in other civilizations and a series of all. I didn't want to give you guys this long thing, but here's a short thing it summarized for me. 3 historically possible outcomes for the lower and middle class because of the way things are going right now. Permanent underclass dependent on subsidies and losing dignity and purpose. I mean, they're stuck there, and they just have to live off of what they're given. Universal basic income society where the state becomes provider and controller. Social fragmentation leading to riots, radical movements, and strongman politics. I mean, this is just kind of what's going to unfold if we don't see an end. It's not even an end, because in some ways it's not a problem to be fixed. Is new technology a problem to be fixed? It's not really. It's progress. Are people going to stop making new inventions to do things better? No one here complained when they made the hairdryer. No one complained when we've always been excited that new technology is making our lives better. The problem is that it's slowly edging out people's jobs. And as the state, Washington or national or whatever, I posted this as a thought before I came here, as we keep increasing minimum wages, because some people see that there's people in need. And so what we need to do is increase the minimum wage. They're unintentionally making those people expendable. Because when it's between them or a machine, any wise business who's still trying to make a profit is going to pick the machine. I don't blame them. I'll shop at a small store. You get the personal feel. But it's at the same time, I don't blame a big business for doing what is profitable. And when they're getting their hands forced, we're just not going to hire all these people. And when the agricultural costs get too high, and at the point is it's like, well, I can hire apple pickers or I can buy an apple picker. Eventually, it's just going to be a decision on making a profit. It's better to buy the apple picking machine. Eventually, it's better to buy all the automated stuff because we can't afford to pay the people. Warehouse providers, truck drivers. That last list, how many of those are Grandview, Lower Valley jobs? You know what I mean? Like, these are the jobs of the people in our church and our friends and neighbors and things like that. It says 5 to 15 years. Don't expect many of these jobs to still be around. Now, second to last slide, time frame of decline. When debt, birth rate collapse, not enough people being born, labor displacement, that's you're getting replaced by robots, and centralization converge, as in the government taking over, civilizations historically enter rapid decline within 20 to 60 years. The West, including America, reached this convergence point roughly between 2008 and 2020. Like, we've already hit that point. And so it's saying, if you pick 2020 or 2008 as the date, and just like I showed you how the timelines got closer and closer and closer and closer and closer, I'm going to go with the small number. I'm going to go with the 20-year breakdown. That means that things should fall apart by 2028. And luckily, for once, we're on track for something, right? So it's an interesting thing when you look at it. And I like this. And this one I will give great kudos to ChatGPT for what it helped him put together. Again, I reworded some stuff. I didn't reword this. The summary: the lower class becomes economically unnecessary. The middle class becomes structurally fragile. The upper class becomes exponentially more powerful. The state becomes provider. The citizen becomes dependent. And I liked this. The church either becomes a resistance movement or a compliance system. And I think, yes, we're approaching an age where we're going to choose one of the two. We're either going to be a resistance movement or a compliance system. I'm sure you all can guess which one I'm shooting for. Option 3, teach the Bible and sing songs, and that's all I ever know. I wish, right? I wish that that's all it'd ever be, but no, it's just coming where we just got to be able to continue to stand fast, and we got to do what we got to do. And if we know the Word of God, which next week we're getting back to verse by verse, I won't be using ChatGPT for nothing because I'm just going through the Bible, and there'll be good times. But it is, when we know the Bible, we can obey the Bible. And so that way, when these fiery trials come upon us, we'll be prepared because we already know what we stand for. We already know what we believe. We don't need to question anything. There's no reason to pray about what Jesus and God's word has already spoken about, right? I already know what I'm supposed to do in these situations. I'm going to hold fast to the word of God. And so, State of the Union, not so great. Could there be changes in America that delay the inevitable? Yeah. There could be some good changes that buy us some time. But like I was saying, I don't even need biblical prophecy to show me things are moving in a direction where they're never going to be able to come back from. And some of it's not, again, is it bad that they've made robots that can flip burgers? No. But we see where this is going. And I just don't know what's going to happen to all the young people and all the, no other way of putting it, unskilled people, right? There's only going to be a handful of jobs with unique skills. But even those, a lot of those lists were actually skilled jobs, right? But again, if you're only an entry-level artist or an entry-level bookkeeper or an entry-level this or that, AI can do that. So you either need to be really good at what you do or you're going to find yourself unemployed. So, Maranatha, come Lord Jesus, come, right? I mean, that's what we're supposed to be doing, keeping our eyes, look up for your redemption draws near. That's what we're supposed to be doing, is just keeping our eyes on the Lord, eyes on the prize, focused on what we ought to be doing. And because I don't like getting caught up in this stuff. That's my final thing. I don't like getting caught up in this stuff. I really don't. I don't spend a lot of time doing like the news and the prophecy and what's changing and all these things, because all I know is that no matter what I do there, nothing changes here. How I ought to live my daily life doesn't change because I already know that he should be coming soon, and I need to live my life like he's coming like a thief in the night, and I don't know the hour he's coming, so I should be prepared and let no one take my crown. I read that here. I didn't get that out of a newspaper or from ChatGPT or from whatever. So that's what we need to do. Cling to his word, cling to what we've always known we should be doing as Christians, and we'll be doing fine. Let's pray. Lord Jesus, help us. This world it's changing quickly.